We began as wanderers, and we are wanderers still. Carl Sagan. I grew up at the end of what is sometimes referred to by historians as the space race. That period when the post-World War II superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, sought to express the superiority of their cultures and economic systems through a series of breakthrough achievements on the frontier of human exploration, leaving the one place humanity had been confined to for all of its long existence to venture into the great beyond. Beginning with the paradigm-shifting launch of Sputnik 1 on October 4th of 1957, and ending with the Apollo-Soyuz mission link-up in July of 1975, this generation-long push to extend the boundaries of human exploration resulted in not only placing 12 human beings over a series of missions on another world, the Earth's moon, for the first time, but it resulted in the development of a huge number of technologies that formed the foundation of much of the innovation that makes our modern lifestyle in the developed world possible. Perhaps the most tangible example of this are the cell phones many of us carry around with us every day that are built on and that incorporate the communications and locations technologies, as well as the astronomical, pun intended, computing power that were initially developed to place human beings on the moon and allow them to relay their experience back to those of us who followed their exploration from the safety of the only place we know that will support life in the cosmos. When we take out that small, square box, packed with cameras, antennas, microphones and speakers, and a battery to power it all, we are holding in our hands the direct descendant of the tools Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin carried on their back down the ladder of the lunar lander nearly 50 years ago. When I was 6 years old, like many children I suppose, I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to be like those heroes who had braved so many dangers and uncertainties to travel into space. I remember as a child reading everything I could find about the U.S. space program and learning that the pilots they had selected had to be no taller than 5 feet 8 inches in height to fit into the capsules that allowed them to navigate the vast, inhospitable distances. And so in my evening prayers, I prayed that I would grow no taller than that. A prayer that seems to have been answered, as I am exactly 5 feet 8 inches tall. If I'd only had the foresight to pray for my eyesight to remain perfect as well. By that time, though, the space race was over. Like a lot of people, I think I didn't know that. The country had been sold the program, not in terms of, cynical realpolitik, a way to express how much better we were than those other guys, but as a grand adventure in scientific exploration. And so there were many of us, especially those of us who were younger, who thought the adventure would go on and on. Sure, there hadn't been a launch of humans into space for a while at a certain point in my life, but that was just a pause. The media materials we saw in the classrooms showed human beings on Mars. What we didn't realize was that when the political points had been made, funding for the enormously expensive endeavor was diverted to other priorities, and the great rockets were mothballed. But that didn't mean that the exploration had ended, or that there weren't scientific questions that needed to be asked and investigated. There were other worlds still to be explored. And so it was that the space race morphed into something different as I grew up. Big, splashy human accomplishments, the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first spacewalk, etc., were replaced with smaller, less relatable breakthroughs made by robots. As a species, we began to send out a small fleet of tools to extend the range of our own senses to worlds more distant and less accessible. There were mariners and pioneers, Lunas and Veneras and Vikings, and then 2 Voyagers. These traveling scientific outposts took our instruments to new worlds and showed us new vistas never before imagined. None more so than those 2 final probes of the series, Voyagers 1 and 2. For me, the Voyager missions were both a revelation and a coming of age. In a time before instant media access to everything, we had to wait for the pictures to come back. The news media had shared small glimpses, wedged in between whatever political or economic issues of the day were deemed important. But for me, it was National Geographic and their monthly magazine that shared the wonder of Jupiter with the world. My long-lagging interest in astronomy was immediately revived as I saw swirling cloud patterns and active volcanoes on Io. I read the article over and over, hoping to learn every single scrap of information there. Not long after came Cosmos, and, well, the course of my intellectual life was sealed. I realized that much more than being an astronaut, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. I didn't so much want to go to the stars as understand them. What's remarkable is that the two probes are still voyaging, both now out into interstellar space, beyond the boundary created by our star's solar wind. Their faint telemetry signals still tell us how fast they are traveling and what the magnetic fields are like where they are. Even as the once young scientists who began their careers on the imaging teams that showed us the gas giants and their systems of moons retire, our mechanical emissaries travel on and on into the vastness of the distance between the stars. As they have left our small solar neighborhood, they have occasionally turned back from whence they came, and by taking photographs, reminded us of our place in the cosmos. To use Dr. Sagan's term, a pale blue dot, a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. There, of course, have been great scientific missions of exploration and discovery since then. The Galileo and Cassini space probes that were sent to Jupiter and Saturn, the long-term mission of the International Space Station, the missions to comets and asteroids to probe the leftovers of the solar system's era of formation and consolidation. However, I think it is the Voyager missions, and perhaps the New Horizons mission to Pluto and beyond, that best represent that instinctual imperative we have as a species to explore and discover in this postmodern period. It is an imperative that has brought us from our evolutionary cradle in Africa to every part of our globe and beyond. And with this has also been a desire to record our explorations for future generations, to make it possible for them to follow each preceding wanderer's path in order to extend it a bit further. Beginning with the mental pictures we create by our repeated travels and explorations, humans in nearly every place and in nearly every culture have found ways to record their wanderings more permanently. Painted on cave walls, etched into bones, drawn on bark and papyrus, our mental pictures of space and place become a record of our explorations. It is through these records and artifacts that we can trace our paths and the knowledge they have revealed to us, and so it is that we can discover where we've been through the maps we have left behind. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 5, Finding Our Way. Episode 1, Uncharted Waters. Before we invented civilization, our ancestors lived mainly out in the open, out under the sky. Before we devised artificial lights and atmospheric pollution and modern forms of nocturnal entertainment, we watched the stars. There were practical calendar reasons, of course, But there was more to it than that. Even today, the most jaded city dweller can be unexpectedly moved upon encountering a clear night sky studded with thousands of twinkling stars. When it happens to me after all these years, it still takes my breath away. Carl Sagan, Pale Blue Dot. We live in a truly remarkable time. The technology available to us now allows us to do and know things that would have been impossible just a generation or two ago. The modern mobile phone, with its ability to connect to a knowledge library that spans cultures, access a global positioning satellite system that will mark a location within a few meters, communicate with other electronic systems that are similarly connected, and measure global and local magnetic fields to know its direction, is something that would have seemed truly miraculous, if not magical, to anyone 150 years ago, and still, to most, just 60 years ago. But as is always the case with such technology, this comes at a cost. I'm not talking about the social consequences that technology always brings with it, but rather, I mean a knowledge lost or replaced, perspective shifted or altered, skills and abilities atrophied. The cell phone has given us much, but it has, for an increasingly large number of people, replaced a great deal of what was once thought necessary to live. Let me give you an example of this, perhaps maybe one that's a bit simpler or more familiar in nature. I can remember a day several years ago when I was involved in the various household chores one does. I was loading the dishwasher, and my internal monologue was sort of complaining about having to do this kind of work. Perhaps you know the litany. I have so much other, more important stuff to do, but here I am, stuck with having to clean, first world problems, as the saying goes. But that led me to recall when I was a kid, and we didn't have a machine that washed the dishes in our home. Instead, I was the dishwasher. Mom would cook the meal, but my brother and I would have to take turns washing and drying the dishes and then putting them away. It wasn't back-breaking labor by any means, but it did take longer than loading a machine with the dirty dishes and pushing a button. What was more interesting, though, was that as I loaded the machine, I tried to remember what it had been like to do the dishes manually. What surprised me was how long it took me to remember the best way to do the job by hand. I actually wondered if we did actually have all the supplies we would need to do the job. As I finished that chore, I moved on to the next task on my list, which involved doing laundry, and it occurred to me that as I was loading the washing machine, that I had never washed my clothes any other way. Unlike with the doing of the dishes, we'd always had a machine that would do the work of cleaning our clothes and another that would dry them. In fact, I didn't know exactly how I would go about actually washing my clothes, at least for something more than just a few small items, other than maybe trying to use the shower or the bathtub. As I considered that, I realized what a labor-intensive thing doing laundry must have been for most of human history. This led me to realize that the detergent I was using was also a technology that I didn't know how to create, even in its most basic form, at least at that time. All of this technology had come along and made my life easier and safer, less filled with dirt and disease, but it had cost me knowledge that my ancestors had once known. So too is it now for many who use their mobile devices as the information centers of their lives. If they want to get somewhere, they pull up an app and ask it to provide directions and then follow the path determined by a combination of GPS hardware and software working with an artificial intelligence program to determine the best way to get from point A to point B. It's a really amazing thing, but there's a cost, of course. How many people can no longer read a physical map and determine a path? Or even if one removes that relatively recent bit of technology, at least relatively recent when compared to the 100,000 year or so span that Homo sapiens have been traveling, could one actually navigate? Could one find their way? Without a mobile device or compass, could you find north? And by the way, if you listen to our Finding Our Place series, I'll bet you could. Could you travel across long distances to arrive at a predetermined location without the technologies we've all grown so accustomed to? It's an interesting question. Our ancestors could. Hunter-gatherers, whether they be Native Americans on the great North American plains, steppe nomads of Central Asia, or the aboriginal peoples of the Australian outback, could navigate hundreds or thousands of miles without maps, guided instead by the stars, the winds, hard-learned techniques, and an oral tradition taught from cradle to grave. Technological progress always comes at the cost of something replaced. What did we do before there were phones or even maps? How did we find our way? Of course, this all goes back to that James Burke Connections episode we referenced way back in our introductory episode for the entire podcast. As he rightly points out, we live in something of a technology trap. To use the example from earlier, I did not know how to make soap for a lot of my life, a technology that's been around since at least 2800 BCE, because its manufacture now has been industrialized, which makes it cheaper and better and easier to obtain. I didn't and still don't have to run around finding and rendering fat, looking for the right kind of potash or wood ash, and then trying to figure out what the right ratio to mix those two things together might be. Just as importantly, I don't have to know how soap works to more effectively pull the dirt, oils, and fats my body deposits into my clothes out of them by hooking onto those things with one end of a molecule that's hydrophobic and then grabbing a water molecule with the other end that's hydrophilic. Navigation in our modern world is like that for a lot of us. We have this powerful technology that tells us where we are and how to get to where we might want to go, but we don't know how it works. How does the phone or similar device connect to one or more of the various GPS satellite systems in orbit around the Earth? How does it use those satellites and their interconnected communications to do the calculations? Do more than just a very small portion of our fellow travelers know the principles of the theory of general relativity that makes such a system possible in the first place? And if, by some unforeseen catastrophe, this system were to fail, how many would find themselves lost and unable to tell direction, especially in the growing mega metropolises that often block out the sky? It's not good enough to have a generation of kids that look forward to a better version of a cell phone with video in it. They need to look forward to exploration. Bert Rattan. Science is exploration. The fundamental nature of exploration is that we don't know what's there. We can guess and hope and aim to find out certain things, but we have to expect surprises. Charles H. Towns. In his book, The Lost Art of Finding Our Way, author John Edward Huth asks his reader to imagine looking over at a fellow morning commuter stuck in traffic on the way to the office. One can imagine seeing that person with the increasingly ubiquitous small thin box held up to their face. Perhaps they're talking into it or tapping on it frantically to let someone on the other end know that they're caught up in traffic and are likely to be late. Maybe they're trying to use one of those previously mentioned embedded technologies to find a faster way around the traffic to avoid whatever the cause of the backup is. All of this information streaming from the outside world through thin air to be processed and condensed and displayed in an easy-to-understand way for the vehicle's occupants. As I said before, it seems almost as if it's magic. But then, Huth wonders what might happen if that same frustrated commuter were asked some very basic questions. Which direction is north in, and how do you know? Can you tell me what time it is without looking at your watch or phone? Can you determine what season it is without a calendar? Or even more fundamentally, can you explain why there are seasons at all? For me, that last question is of particular relevance. Early in my teaching career, I was shown a short film titled A Private Universe. In it, the filmmakers went to graduation day at Harvard University and asked a variety of attendees and participants that very same question. Why does the Earth have seasons? Of the nearly 40 people they asked, only one had something approaching a correct answer. Some of the rest had an answer rooted in a significant misunderstanding of Kepler's laws of planetary motion, while the majority simply had no idea at all. And not to pick on Harvard, the producers said that they had repeated the experiment on a number of college campuses around the United States with similar results. The thesis of the movie was that much of our modern college instruction, especially in the sciences, doesn't actually help people understand the world around them. And as such, the movie has now served as a catalyst in sparking a conversation about what it is that we teach and how we teach it. Huth asks a question in his book that in a sense boils down to, what might have been the outcome had they selected a different audience? What if they had somehow been able to interview people engaged in lifelong farming or fishing practices? What if they'd gone back some 5 or 10,000 years to hunter-gatherer tribes and asked them that question? What's interesting is that the answer given by each of these groups, one that would have been consistent in the knowledge it conveyed, would have been very different from the kinds of answers a knowledgeable and correctly informed person might give now. But, in its own way, that ancient answer would be surprisingly correct. Rather than referencing orbits around the sun and the like, they would have talked about the altitude of the sun in the sky and the length of the days and nights. They would have understood that the higher the sun was at noon, the longer the day would be, and the more directly the sunlight would shine, hence giving rise to greater warmth. As the cycle of lunar phases passed, something they would have tracked religiously, yes, literally, religiously, they would have recognized that when the sun's altitude at noon began to be closer to the horizon, and that the days were getting shorter, at first almost imperceptibly, and then faster and more apparently as the cold season approached, winter was coming. No, the farmer or fisherman wouldn't have been able to tell time to the second, or even to the minute as we do now, but he or she would have had a more intimate sense of the flow of the cyclical experience that made up their lives, what we now call time. So too is it with navigation. A hunter-gatherer wouldn't have been able to determine his clan's place on the earth to an accuracy of within a few meters, but the whole band of them could have traveled hundreds of miles reliably and safely from place to place without the aid of GPS or even detailed maps. We know of Polynesian peoples who navigated thousands of miles across open ocean beginning near the continent of Australia in crafts that were open to the sky, using only the stars and time-tested techniques to not only find many island archipelagos, but also the coast of South America, at least if recent genetic analysis of sweet potatoes is to be believed. As a species, we immigrated out of Africa generation by generation, but we should not mistake that for some random or chaotic process. No, as our curiosity drove us and the climate allowed, we followed first the paths of game animals and migrating birds, and then our own arrived at knowledge to make our way to nearly every part of the globe. And as we developed language and art, we began first to communicate that knowledge with each other, and then record it so that it would not be lost. First drawn on cave walls and etched into bones, the maps that would emerge would, in time, become more portable, more global, and more accurate. It would take centuries, even millennia, but there would come a point when the maps and measurements they represented began to reveal secret knowledge, some of which was physical, some social, some economic. From this, new disciplines of study would be created, from an expansion of geography to encompass more than just the physical maps of our world, to demography and its study of human interaction and congregation, to geodesy, the study and mapping of our very world and its shape and irregularities. And so, as we set sail once again on another voyage of discovery, we here in the Scientific Odyssey will seek to trace, through the artifact of the map, the progression of scientific knowledge of wayfinding, that perhaps most human of endeavors. As such, we will be examining both the artifacts and the artificers, the tools and techniques, the history and methods that allow us to not only know our place, but also where we are going. We may be wanderers, but as Tolkien's most human of rangers, Aragorn, was known to have said, "Not all who wander are lost." We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive at where we started and know the place for the first time. T.S. Eliot. As we wrap up this prologue to our new season, please allow me to make a few comments or caveats, if you will. First, to be clear, our subject matter will be the history of geography and cartography. One of the reasons it took me so long to get this episode out was that I found myself struggling for some time, trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do our history of, as it were. Several other fine podcasts have touched on or even focused on the history of exploration, and I saw no reason to repeat their work. Geography, however, seemed too broad and, to be honest, too recent in some ways, only really splitting off from the broader field of cosmography during the period shortly after Copernicus and Brahe in the West, Eratosthenes' title as the father of geography notwithstanding. It wasn't until I hit both on the title of the series, Finding Our Way, as an extension of our third season of Finding Our Place, and also the recognizing of the importance of using the map as a physical symbol of that progression of knowledge, that I began to find a framework in which to proceed. Second, with apologies to all of the geographers who might come across this, I'm going to be mostly limiting my discussion of geography to what might be thought of as physical geography, or the representation of physical space through various means. While the most interesting work over the last at least 100 years has been done in the realms of what might be thought of as human or social or cultural geography, I felt that these subjects fell outside of the scope of what I wanted to address in this series. This is not intended as a slight of any kind, but rather as an attempt to keep things manageable from a narrative point of view. That having been said, however, there may be, of course, digressions that will follow interesting threads of our narrative down those particular avenues. Third, unlike the previous series, I have to admit to having a much less clear idea of where this is going than I've had in the past. I've got a number of really great resources that I hope will help guide me, but unlike the case with the history of the atom and our discussion of cosmology, I don't have in my head a broad timeline and list of historically important ideas and individuals. Therefore, I'm going to be as interested and, I hope, as excited as you all are to see where the winds of discovery take us from episode to episode. There's a lot of uncharted water for me here too, and I'm curious to see what it is that we're going to learn together. So with that said, gather your provisions and find a berth, as we'll set sail soon. And if you know of any resources you think might be helpful in navigation, let me know, either by sending me an email at cldavies@mac.com, posting to the podcast Facebook page or subreddit, or by personal messaging me on Twitter @ChadDavies. Also, as always, if you know anyone who might find the journey interesting, be sure to invite them along to join the crew. There's always another place. In our next episode, we'll lay out some definitions and then talk about how the earliest explorers might have developed the first mental pictures of their surroundings and travel routes using only their senses. Until then, full sails on your journey.